Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise, bring you the essential insights from stories, from sources that you really need to know about. Today, we're taking a trip, metaphorically speaking, to Florida. You know, the Sunshine State, synonymous with, well, sunshine, beaches, theme parks. Thrilling adventures, really the promise of a perfect escape for so many people. Think about those vibrant beaches, the world-famous parks, endless outdoor stuff, or maybe just that comforting warmth, right, that pulls people away from colder places every winter. For millions, Florida isn't just, a spot on the map. It's this vibrant, welcoming place, sometimes a seasonal home, sometimes that dream vacation. It just projects leisure, excitement, a kind of carefree spirit. But what if I told you that beneath all that gleaming surface, woven right into the legal fabric of Florida, there lies something surprising, something, well, deeply unsettling, actually, a kind of silent divide, if you will, that most people, and I mean especially visitors or folks spending part of the year there, they're just utterly unaware of it. And this divide can have these profoundly tragic implications.
It can catch people, families, completely off guard, right at the worst possible moment. So our mission today is to pull back the curtain on this critical, but like I said, largely hidden aspect of Florida law. We're going to take a deep dive into one specific statute, Florida statute, section 768.218. Now, this isn't some dusty old legal text just for lawyers. No, it's a specific rule that creates this incredibly unusual and, frankly, quite stark legal environment for certain people, particularly visitors, seasonal residents, in the truly awful event of fatal medical negligence. We're going to explore, how this specific law even came about, what it actually means for individuals, for their families, when tragedy strikes, and maybe surprisingly, how it could impact Florida's huge multi-billion-dollar economy, even its international reputation. This is about helping you understand why this isn't just some dry legal statute. It's something with profound real-world implications for, well, anyone thinking about a trip to Florida or maybe spending extended time there. It's a critical piece of information you might just never know about until it's too late.
And that reveals this huge knowledge gap, one that can leave families completely devastated, often without any legal recourse. So to kick off our exploration, maybe you can define this specific law for us. What exactly is Florida statute, section 768.218?
Okay, well, at its core, Florida statute section 768.218 is what lawyers often call a carve-out. Think of a carve-out as like a deliberate exception to a general rule. In this context, the general rule is the right families usually have to pursue a wrongful death claim when, a loved one dies because of someone else's negligence. This statute, Section 8, it creates a very specific exception, or you could call it a source of statutory immunity.
Yeah.
Basically, that means it grants legal protection from certain kinds of lawsuits that would normally be allowed. Its main function is, well, it's pretty stark. It deliberately excludes specific classes of people from recovering something called non-economic damages. And this is specifically in wrongful death cases that result from medical negligence. So if someone dies because of a medical mistake, this statute decides who can, and maybe more importantly, who cannot seek full legal compensation for the non-financial aspects of that terrible loss.
Okay, non-economic damages. Just so we're clear for everyone listening, these are often the biggest part of a wrongful death claim, aren't they? We're talking about the things that don't really have a price tag. Can you give us some examples? What does that actually cover?
Absolutely, and you're right. They are often the most significant part because they represent the human cost of the loss, the emotional devastation, the huge void left in a family's life that, honestly, no amount of money can truly replace. These are the intangible harms, but they're incredibly real. So, for instance, they include things like the pain and suffering the person endured before they died. They also cover the mental anguish, the emotional suffering of the family members left behind, the loss of companionship, instruction, guidance, protection, all the things a loved one provided. Imagine a parent losing a child. You just can't put a dollar amount on missing that child's laughter or the milestones they won't reach or just the comfort of having them there. That's what non-economic damages try to acknowledge, even if it's imperfectly. Now, the specific groups that this Florida statute excludes, they're quite precise, and that's where this carve-out really has its bite. First, it applies to unmarried adults who don't have any minor children. So think about an adult. Maybe a young professional, 20s, 30s, or maybe an older retiree, 70s, 80s. If they don't have a spouse, and they don't have kids under 18, if they die because of medical negligence, maybe their parents, their siblings, They cannot recover any of those non-economic damages we just talked about. None. The second group it affects are parents who are not financially dependent on their adult child who died. And this is a really critical point because financial dependence, legally speaking, has a very, very strict interpretation. It's not just about, getting occasional gifts or maybe some help with a bill now and then. Legally, it usually means you have to show regular, necessary financial contributions needed for the parent's livelihood. This strict definition means that a lot of parents who feel supported by their adult kids or who maybe get some financial help here and there might still not qualify as financially dependent under the actual letter of the law. So even if an adult child was genuinely contributing, helping their parents out, the parent's ability to recover damages for their emotional loss or grief is severely limited if that help doesn't meet that very specific legal bar of dependence.
Right. So just to be absolutely crystal clear for you listening, for these specific people, unmarried adults without minor kids, or parents who aren't legally dependent on the adult child who died if they pass away due to medical negligence, nobody can recover those non-economic damages, even if the medical mistake, the negligence that caused the death, is totally undesirable. Proven.
Precisely. That is the stark reality of this law.
Yeah.
Even in cases where the medical negligence is proven, absolutely beyond doubt, maybe even where a hospital or doctor admits fault, the families of these specific excluded individuals are effectively barred. They're left without a day in court for those profound emotional and personal damages. It means the legal system just offers no path for them to seek compensation for the immense grief, the lost companionship, the emotional hole left in their lives. Now, they might be able to recover economic damages if there are any, things like, say, funeral costs, or maybe lost wages, but only if the deceased person was supporting someone who qualifies as financially dependent. But for the biggest loss, the human part, the loss of that person's presence, their affection, there's simply no legal recourse available under the statute. It's a very specific limitation. And yeah, many people would argue it's a very harsh one. It can leave families feeling like they've been victimized twice over. First by the negligence and then by the law.
That's incredibly powerful. So this isn't just some minor legal technicality, is it? It's a very specific intended outcome. I'm curious, though. When a law like this gets passed, is it usually just an oversight, a mistake in how it was written? Or is there typically a very specific intention behind it? Was this statute, this specific carve-out in subsection 8, just an accident of legislative language? Or was it, a deliberate decision, a calculated choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's really fascinating, or maybe disturbing, depending on your perspective, is that Florida statute, section 768.218, absolutely did not arise by accident. It wasn't an oversight at all. Its origins are actually deeply rooted in a very deliberate legislative campaign. It was enacted back in 1990, and it was a very specific piece of a much broader politically charged movement that's generally known as tort reform. To understand it, you have to picture this concerted effort, this push to fundamentally change the rules around civil lawsuits. A tort is just a civil wrong that causes harm or injury. And reform in this specific context really meant making it harder to sue and limiting the amount of damages people could recover if they won.
Okay, tort reform. So who were the main players then? Who were the driving forces behind this push for reform back in 1990? And what were their main arguments?
Well, the primary drivers were a really powerful coalition of groups. You had insurance companies, hospital associations, various medical lobbying groups all working together. Their collective argument, which they voiced very loudly at the time, was essentially that Florida's existing civil liability laws made it too easy and too expensive to file lawsuits. Especially, they argued, in the area of medical malpractice. They claimed that the high costs of litigation, the sheer number of lawsuits, the risk of large jury payouts, they argued all this was driving up insurance premiums for doctors and hospitals. And they contended this threatened the financial stability of healthcare providers, and ultimately it made healthcare more expensive and maybe less accessible for everybody in Florida. They framed these reforms as necessary for the economic health of the state's healthcare system. The result of all this intense lobbying was this big package of changes, sweeping changes, really, designed explicitly to limit the exposure to lawsuits, particularly for healthcare providers. This wasn't about small tweaks, it was about fundamentally restructuring accountability.
So this specific part, subsection 8, wasn't just a minor thing tucked away. It sounds like it was a really targeted provision within that bigger reform package, designed to achieve a very specific result as part of that larger goal.
Exactly. Subsection 8 was arguably one of the most targeted and most impactful provisions within that whole 1990 reform package. It was absolutely a calculated policy decision. It was meticulously designed to reduce both the number of lawsuits filed and the size of potential payouts. How? by making it economically impractical, essentially, for lawyers to take on certain cases, specifically cases where the potential for recovering significant financial damages like lost future wages would be minimal or maybe even non-existent. The underlying logic from the perspective of the reformers was this. If a claim doesn't offer the realistic prospect of a substantial economic recovery for a lawyer, especially one working on a contingency fee, then even if the medical negligence was clear as day, and even if a profound personal loss occurred, attorneys would simply be less incentivized to take on that case. And this, in turn, would limit how often hospitals and doctors face large settlements or jury verdicts. It achieved their goal of reducing liability costs. It created this powerful disincentive to pursue justice for certain kinds of losses purely based on economics.
Right. And what were the consequences then of this calculated policy decision? It was framed as being necessary for economic stability for the healthcare system. But what was the actual impact on real people, individuals and families?
Well, while it was presented as this necessary step for the economic stability of healthcare, the profound effect of this statute was essentially to strip away the right to full legal redress. And it did this for entire categories of individuals based solely on their family status. Unmarried, no minor kids, parents not financially dependent. It basically created a legal loophole, a shield, really, that primarily protects what we call institutional defendants. So hospitals, clinics, individual doctors, often at the direct expense of patients and their grieving families. It's a really stark illustration of how economic considerations in this instance were prioritized over principles of full accountability, over legal recourse for these profound personal losses. This wasn't some kind of unforeseen side effect of a well-meaning law. It was a deliberate legislative choice, crafted very carefully to achieve a specific outcome, limiting liability for medical providers even when they were clearly negligent, by making certain deaths, from a purely legal and financial standpoint, carry little to no significant consequence for the party responsible.
That's a really critical point to grasp. It wasn't an accident. It was by design. So for you, our listener, this really encourages us to think about the profound implications of a deliberate legislative choice like that. Is it truly fair? Is it just to prioritize economic protection for one sector, for healthcare providers, over what many sees as a fundamental right to legal recourse for grieving families, especially when that distinction, that line, is drawn purely based on the family status of the person who died? It certainly raises some very difficult, very fundamental questions about justice. Okay, now let's try to connect these legal details to why this matters so much for Florida as a whole. The Sunshine State, as we said, attracts millions. People come for adventure, for outdoor activities. They flock here for the sun-drenched beaches, the thrilling theme parks, world-class scuba diving, boating, jet skiing, hiking. You name it, Florida probably offers it. But what happens when all that fun, all that excitement, takes an unexpected sharp turn into a hospital visit? What's the risk profile actually like for medical events in such a high-volume tourism environment?
That's an absolutely crucial connection to make, because Florida's environment, with its sheer volume of tourism and its heavy emphasis on active pursuits, it inherently carries a non-negligible risk of medical events, events that can lead to hospitalization, and then, unfortunately, potentially to medical error within that hospital setting. Just think about the huge number of people doing all sorts of activities every single day. Take scuba diving and snorkeling. Enthusiasts face risks like decompression sickness, the bends, accidental drownings in open water, cardiac events happening underwater, equipment failures causing distress, even things like boat collisions. Any one of those could require immediate, very high-stakes emergency medical care.
Right. Things can go wrong quickly in those situations.
Exactly. Or think about parasailing and jet skiing. These are high-speed activities. They can lead to severe falls, really high-impact crashes, debilitating injuries like spinal trauma, traumatic brain injuries, severe fractures needing complex surgery.
Yeah, you see stories about those sometimes.
You do. Then there are amusement parks. Now, they have stringent safety measures, of course, but incidents still happen. It could be anything from a ride malfunction causing physical trauma to severe heat stroke in that intense Florida sun. Or maybe tram or transport accidents within the park grounds, outbreaks of foodborne illness from vendors, even crowd-related injuries in really dense areas.
Lots of potential issues there, too.
Definitely. What about boating and fishing tours? Propeller accidents are horrific, but possible. Sudden, severe weather blowing up at sea, slips and falls on wet decks, vessel collisions, all things that can cause serious injury, often far from immediate medical help.
Yeah.
Then you have hiking in state parks, wilderness areas. Visitors can suffer from severe heat exhaustion, heat stroke in Florida's humidity, encounters with venomous snakes or even alligators, falls on uneven ground, severe allergic reactions to insects or plants, especially in places like the Everglades.
Nature has its dangers, too.
It does. And even seemingly simple beach and ocean activities aren't without risk. Powerful rip currents can quickly overwhelm even strong swimmers. Painful jellyfish stings, stingray injuries if you step on one, and tragically, accidental drownings in the surf.
Yeah, rip currents are a big one.
They are. We also have to consider severe weather events. Florida is notoriously prone to hurricanes, other intense weather. During those events, you can see injuries from evacuations, trauma from windblown debris, or even hospital overcrowding that delays critical care for other issues.
A unique Florida risk, for sure.
And finally, just think about car accidents in rental vehicles. You've got millions of tourists on roads they don't know, often navigating really high-traffic cities like Miami, Orlando, Tampa. Statistically, there's just an elevated accident rate, especially among out-of-state drivers maybe not used to local conditions or driving styles.
Okay, so a wide range of potential incidents.
A very wide range. And here's the critical link back to our topic. In each and every one of these scenarios, an injury, whether it starts as minor or as severe from the outset, can tragically turn fatal because of subsequent medical negligence. Whether that's a mistaken diagnosis, a lapse in emergency care, giving the wrong medication, a botched surgery, or maybe just a failure to properly monitor a patient's condition. A survivable injury can, in these awful circumstances, become a deadly one due to a preventable medical error. And that is precisely the point where this specific Florida statute dramatically, tragically, alters the legal landscape for the family left behind. So this really brings up a crucial question. Given Florida's status as this top global tourist destination, attracting millions from all over the world, how does this specific law actually play out for a tourist? Someone who might tragically die from medical negligence while they're just visiting. Imagine, a young professional full of life on their dream vacation. They get into one of these risky situations we talked about, end up in a Florida hospital, and then die because of a medical mistake. What happens then?
So under what specific, just heartbreaking conditions would this legal trap, as the source material seems to imply, spring for them, making them essentially a victim twice over?
Yeah, legal trap is a strong term, but it reflects how families can feel. The trap springs if the deceased tourist meets those precise exclusion criteria we discussed from Florida Statute Section 768.218. So again, if they are unmarried at the time of their death, if they have no minor children, and if their parents are not considered financially dependent on them according to that strict legal definition, then despite clear medical negligence causing their death, no one, not their grieving parents back home, not their siblings, not other loved ones, can recover those non-economic damages from the hospital or the doctor responsible. It's like a legal cliff edge that most people, especially tourists, don't even know exists until they or their family fall off it.
And what are the direct, just crushing consequences of that for the family? What does it truly mean in human terms to be barred from seeking damages for, the loss of companionship, the emotional devastation?
The consequences are severe, and they hit families right when they're at their absolute most vulnerable. First, hospitals and doctors are effectively shielded from full accountability for the immense emotional and personal devastation caused by their negligence. There's less incentive, legally and financially, to ensure such mistakes don't happen again to similar patients. Second, the family is essentially left without a day in court to seek redress for these profound, intangible losses. They can't ask the legal system to acknowledge the depth of their grief, the value of the lost relationship. Now, as I mentioned, they might be able to recover economic damages if any exist, funeral costs, maybe medical bills incurred before death, perhaps lost wages, but again, only if the deceased was financially supporting someone who legally qualifies as dependent. But for the most profound loss, the loss of the person, their companionship, their guidance, their love, their affection, the sheer emotional void, there is simply no legal avenue for compensation under this Florida law. And this really highlights what we call asymmetric knowledge. Tourists, they're excited about their trip, right? Focused on fun, maybe general safety precautions. They simply may never know about the specific law until it's far, far too late. This just compounds the injustice and their vulnerability. They arrive expecting, reasonably, the same kinds of legal protections they might have in their home state or their home country, only to discover, after an unimaginable tragedy, that Florida operates under this unique set of rules that offers them or their family much less recourse. It's a truly shocking and often enraging reality for many who only learn about it after they've lost someone they love.
And it's not just the short-term tourists, right? The people visiting for a week or two. What about the thousands, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands,
of part-time residents. You know, the people often called snowbirds. They call Florida their second home for months every year. It feels like they're often overlooked in this whole discussion, yet they're a really significant demographic for Florida.
They absolutely are, and it's a critical point. Discussing the full impact of this statute without considering the snowbirds is missing a huge part of the picture. The snowbird population is enormous, and it's incredibly economically vital to Florida. These are typically retirees, mostly from northern U.S. states or Canada. They migrate south to escape the harsh winter months. Often they're residing in Florida from, say, November through April, sometimes even longer. Now, while they might not be formal, full-time residents with a Florida driver's license, their contribution to the state is massive. Many own property condos, houses paying significant local property taxes. They actively participate in local economies. They eat at restaurants, shop in local stores, go to entertainment venues. They spend a lot of money over those months. And crucially, they engage extensively with Florida's healthcare system during these extended stays. They see Florida doctors for routine checkups. They get prescriptions filled at local pharmacies. They use local labs and diagnostic centers, and of course they rely on Florida's emergency services and hospitals if something acute happens. They really embed themselves in the community for, half the year, often for many, many years.
So if one of these individuals, someone spending 5-6 months a year in Florida, maybe for decades, deeply connected to a community there if they die due to medical negligence, they face the exact same harsh legal reality as a transient tourist just visiting for a week.
Precisely. That's exactly right. If one of these snowbirds, and remember many of them are likely to be unmarried, perhaps widowed, or have adult children who are independent and not financially dependent on them. If they die due to medical negligence while they are residing in Florida for the winter, subsection 8 applies just the same. It can equally bar their family, their adult children perhaps, from recovering any non-economic damages. The law, as it's currently written, makes absolutely no distinction based on how long you're there, how much you contribute, whether you own property. None of that matters. The legal consequence is identical whether you're a tourist on a quick vacation or a part-year resident who contributes significantly to the state's economy and civic life month after month, year after year. It's a very blunt instrument. It categorizes people solely based on their marital status and the age and dependency of their children, not based on their connection or contribution to the state.
That's a powerful phrase you used earlier, statutory silence. It really suggests more than just an absence of legal recourse. It almost implies a kind of institutional indifference to a profound human loss, but only for these specific groups.
It does feel that way to the families affected, certainly. If the individual meets those exclusion criteria, unmarried, no minor kids, parents not financially dependent their death, even if caused by clear medical negligence, is met not with legal accountability for the profound human loss, but with this statutory silence. And this creates this deep justice gap, not just for tourists passing through, but for thousands upon thousands of part-time residents who genuinely consider Florida their second home. Sometimes, it's even their primary home in spirit in terms of where they spend most of their time and feel most connected, even if they haven't formally declared residency. They have deep roots, community ties, they contribute substantially to the tax base and local economy. Yet, in this incredibly critical legal aspect, the right to seek justice after a wrongful death, they are treated no differently than someone just passing through for a long weekend. It really makes you question the fundamental fairness of a system that treats these long-term, contributing seasonal residents who often rely heavily on Florida's healthcare services exactly the same as a transient visitor, especially when it comes to matters of life, death, and accountability. It strongly suggests a prioritization of institutional protection over the very people the state actively seeks to attract and serve.
Okay, so if this is the reality for individuals, for families, both tourists and snowbirds, what kind of ripple effect does this have on Florida itself? I mean, this is a state whose whole identity, whose massive economy is so deeply tied to welcoming visitors. What does this all mean for Florida's multi-billion-dollar tourism engine? This can't just be about individual tragedies, right? Surely there have to be broader economic, maybe reputational consequences for the state.
You're absolutely right to broaden the scope. It's not just about individual heartbreak. There are potentially huge implications for Florida's economy. Florida's reliance on tourism is profound. It's almost unparalleled in the U.S. You mentioned the numbers in 2023. Tourism revenue topped a staggering $100 billion, nearly 140 million visitors. And this isn't just about theme park tickets, right? It's hotels, restaurants, car rentals, local attractions, shops, cruises, everything. All the jobs and services that support this massive industry. Now, a huge chunk of these visitors are U.S. citizens. And critically, millions of them fall squarely into the age groups most likely to be affected by this specific law. We're talking young adults, maybe traveling before starting families, and retirees whose children are grown and independent. These groups are the lifeblood of Florida's tourism economy.
So it's a kind of cruel irony. The very demographic that is most vulnerable under this statute is also the same demographic that the state's economy relies on so heavily. That seems like a critical vulnerability for Florida itself.
It is, exactly. The potential losses for Florida are substantial, and they could ripple across many different sectors. Think about it. If even a relatively small fraction of potential visitors, whether they're domestic tourists deciding between Florida and, say, California or Arizona, or international travelers choosing a destination were to learn about this, learn that dying from medical negligence in Florida might carry no meaningful legal remedy for their families, it could have a significant chilling effect on their choices. Imagine the thought process. Wow, if something terrible happens there, my family might not even have the basic right to seek justice for my loss.
Yeah.
If visitors start to question the safety, the accountability of Florida's healthcare system, if they start comparing Florida unfavorably to other states or other countries that maybe have more balanced tort laws, the state genuinely stands to lose billions in tourism dollars, convention business, maybe even impacts on real estate values if snowbirds become hesitant. This isn't just about a few isolated cases anymore. It's about the overall perception, the trust in the system. And once that trust erodes, it can be incredibly difficult and expensive to rebuild. And you have to remember, this risk is amplified exponentially in our digital age. We've all seen how fast information, or sometimes misinformation, can spread online. Virally. A single high-profile, heartbreaking story shared widely on social media, picked up by international news outlets, it could do permanent damage to Florida's reputation, especially when it involves something as sensitive, as emotional as a wrongful death where justice is denied. Just imagine the stark, undeniable headline that could flash across news feeds globally. Tourist dies in Florida, hospital grieving parents barred from filing wrongful death lawsuit due to state law. And the thing is, this isn't some hypothetical scenario we're just making up for effect. It is the literal statutory reality dictated by Florida statute section 768.218 in specific tragic circumstances. The potential for stories like that to spread globally and just irreparably tarnish Florida's brand, its image as a safe, welcoming, accountable place to visit, it's immense. It transforms from being a somewhat obscure legal nuance into a potential public relations nightmare.
Okay, let's try to put this into perspective with something maybe more familiar, more relatable for people. How would we as a society react if this exact same policy, the statutory silence you described, applied somewhere else, say at an amusement park, another huge draw for Florida visitors? What do you think the public outcry would look like then?
That's a really powerful comparison. And I think it does a good job of exposing the inherent injustice, maybe even the double standard at play here. Just imagine for a moment if Walt Disney World, right, one of Florida's most iconic family-oriented attractions, imagine if they had a clause hidden in the fine print on the back of your park ticket, and that clause said something like, attention, if your adult child who doesn't have any minor children of their own dies here at our park due to the negligence of one of our employees, maybe a ride operator error, faulty equipment, whatever, you, the parents, are legally barred from suing us for your emotional loss, for your grief, for the loss of their companionship. What would the public reaction be? It would be immediate and it would be seismic, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. People would be outraged.
Outraged. It would be seen as morally reprehensible, legally unconscionable. You'd have an immediate, massive public outcry, widespread calls for boycotts, probably intense media scrutiny, maybe even swift legislative action, perhaps even at the federal level, to shut down such a blatantly unfair provision. No one would accept that from a private entertainment company. Frankly, no major company would likely dare to explicitly state such a policy because the backlash would be devastating.
Yet, the parallel you're drawing here is that this outcome being barred from suing for non-economic damages under these specific family circumstances, this is precisely the result that Florida statute section 768.211 guarantees when hospitals and healthcare providers are involved in a fatal negligence case.
Exactly. The source material we looked at refers to this situation using the provocative term legalized negligence. And it uses that term to vividly illustrate how this statute appears to prioritize economic convenience, essentially, financial protection for healthcare institutions and their insurance companies above what many would consider a fundamental moral obligation to provide justice and accountability when a life is tragically lost due to error. The public wouldn't tolerate this outcome from a theme park, which is ultimately about entertainment. But because this law is, cloaked in complex legal language, because it applies within the often intimidating medical setting, and because it operates in relative obscurity for most people, many are simply unaware of its existence or its profound implications until, tragically, it affects them or someone they know. It highlights this profound double standard. And it underscores the powerful influence of the lobbying efforts back in 1990 that successfully carved out this protection for one specific sector, leaving an outcome in the critical realm of life and death that would likely be unthinkable politically and socially in almost any other commercial context. Now, if we really try to connect all these dots, look at the bigger picture. The reach of this statute, its implications, they actually extend far beyond U.S. borders. This raises some really significant international travel implications, and even the potential for diplomatic scrutiny down the line. There is a very plausible and, I'd say, growing concern that foreign governments might eventually take notice of how this particular Florida statute affects their citizens when they travel here, particularly governments from countries with strong consumer protection laws and robust legal accountability standards back home.
Okay, which countries are we talking about here, specifically? Which nations send a lot of visitors to Florida and might be most concerned? And what kind of formal actions could they potentially take?
Well, you'd primarily be looking at nations like Canada, which sends a huge number of tourists and snowbirds. Also the United Kingdom, France, Germany, many European nations, really. These countries send millions of tourists and seasonal residents to Florida every year. And critically, they all have well-established formal mechanisms for issuing travel advisories. These advisories are designed to caution their citizens about potential legal risks, health risks, safety risks they might encounter in foreign countries. They take their citizens' welfare abroad very seriously. And importantly, their own legal systems generally provide a broad right for families to seek damages, including non-economic damages, for profound personal losses like wrongful death. So, if awareness of Florida statute section 768.2121 increases internationally, maybe because of media coverage of high-profile cases where grieving families from these countries are denied legal recourse in Florida, these foreign governments might feel compelled, maybe even obligated, to warn their citizens. Now, such warnings wouldn't necessarily be, don't go to Florida. It might be more subtle. Often, it's a level 1 or maybe level 2 caution in their travel advice section online. It might simply note something like, exercise increased caution. Non-resident visitors to Florida should be aware that state law may limit legal protection in the event of fatal medical error, specifically regarding the recovery of non-economic damages for certain family members. Even a seemingly mild factual caution like that, issued officially by governments like Canada or the UK, could have a really significant chilling effect on Florida's reputation. It could subtly shift perceptions, making Florida seem less safe, less reliable, less just than competing destinations. And think about the insurance angle. Canadian insurers, for instance, they provide a lot of supplemental medical insurance for Canadians traveling to the U.S. If this Florida statute, subsection 8, starts to be viewed by them as creating an undue financial risk, maybe because it reduces accountability and could theoretically impact quality of care, or perhaps because it complicates their own subrogation rights, they might react. They could potentially start incorporating specific exclusions or maybe just disclaimers in their policies regarding treatment received in Florida hospitals specifically linked to the statute. Such a move could significantly complicate travel planning and costs for Canadians who, as we've said, make up a huge segment of Florida's vital snowbird population. It might make them question the value of their insurance when in Florida, or even the wisdom of choosing Florida as their winter destination year after year.
Wow. So this could actually become a really complicated diplomatic and economic issue then. It's not just a domestic legal quirk. It sounds like a domestic policy choice with potentially far-reaching international consequences.
Absolutely. That's the potential trajectory. If even just a small number of these tragic cases involving foreign nationals gain significant international media attention, the results could be quite substantial for Florida. You could potentially see formal diplomatic inquiries from foreign governments to the State Department or Florida officials seeking clarification or even pushing for changes to the law. You might see a surge in public outcry abroad, with foreign citizens questioning Florida's commitment to justice for visitors. Or you could see tangible shifts in travel patterns, convention bookings, and insurance policies that directly negatively impact Florida's tourism economy. So, what started as a domestic statute, quietly passed decades ago, primarily to insulate one sector of the healthcare industry from certain lawsuits, could ultimately draw widespread international scrutiny. Scrutiny for appearing to prioritize legal immunity over fundamental justice, particularly at the expense of human lives and the profound losses suffered by families, including those of the international visitors who are so essential to Florida's economic well-being and its global image.
Wow. This has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive today, really. We've uncovered this surprising, often hidden reality of Florida statute, Section 768.218. We've delved into its origins, not an accident, but a calculated legislative move during that whole tort reform era back in 1990. We've seen its profound, often silent, but devastating impact on individuals, on grieving families, on tourists who arrive completely unaware, and even on those long-term seasonal residents, the snowbirds. And we've also explored how this single, specific statute could ripple outwards, potentially affecting Florida's massive multi-billion-dollar tourism economy and its carefully cultivated international reputation. It's just such a complex tapestry of law, economics, ethics, and very real human impact.
So what does this all really mean for you, our listener? We've spent this time delving into how a seemingly obscure legal detail buried in the state statutes can have these profound, far-reaching consequences. Consequences for individuals, for families, and potentially even for an entire state's economy and its standing on the world stage. It really urges us, I think, to consider that delicate and often very challenging balance. The balance between legal protections for institutions, powerful economic interests, and what many consider fundamental moral obligations in a society that, at least ideally, prides itself on justice and accountability. You know, if Florida's identity, if its incredibly robust economy are truly inseparable from the millions of people who visit or who call it home for part of each year, then perhaps the laws of the state need to fully reflect that reality, not create these hidden, potentially devastating exclusions. Florida Statute Section 768.21 clearly establishes this silent divide, a divide that shields negligence in certain fatal cases, that excludes grieving families from having their full day in court for their most profound losses. And that, to many observers, seems to place the economic convenience of one sector above a clear moral obligation of accountability when mistakes cost a life. The ultimate question, I suppose, for all of us, and perhaps especially for Florida's voters, its lawmakers, its tourism industry leaders, and its business owners, is whether the perceived cost of economic convenience truly outweighs the very real moral and reputational price of this statutory silence and the profound injustice it can inflict. If Florida truly depends on its visitors, perhaps it owes them more than just sunshine. Perhaps it owes them a fundamental, unwavering promise of justice and accountability, regardless of their family status.